Hello everyone, my name is Bonolo and on this channel I talk about South African history, politics and culture. And in this video I want to chat about Tyla, her recent feature in Dazed magazine, her rise and status as an international pop icon, and the continuing discussion about race in different post-colonial societies. I would have liked to have finished my essay on broadcasting and blackness before delving into pop culture and politics, a field I love and hope to grow in. But I've seen a lot of discourse about Tyla almost automatically result in a bubbling up of underlying issues. This is not a deep dive on her, but a third world miss exploration into art history, impact in visual art, cultural flows, and globalization, and my attempt at documenting the origins and metamorphosis of African cultural practices and popular culture. I was inspired to make this video by a movie I saw several years ago and the story behind it that informed my understanding of classical visual art in historical context and opened my eyes to the dynamics, visual and cultural of a lot of contemporary art. The 2013 period drama Belle depicts the life of an illegitimate mixed-race girl who is raised by her father's aristocratic family in 18th century England. The film was inspired by a painting of Dido Elizabeth Belle Lindsay, whose mother, Maria Belle, was an enslaved 14-year-old in the British West Indies when she got impregnated by Sir John Lindsay, who later took her and the baby back to England with him. Maria is said to have received a piece of property from Lindsay, but he never acknowledged Dido or left her anything to inherit. He has died, we believe, without any legitimate issue, but has left one natural daughter, Nyathi, who has been brought up in Lord Mansfield's family almost from her infancy and whose amiable disposition and accomplishments have gained her the highest respects from all his lordship's relations and visitants. Lindsay seems to have felt some obligation towards the survival and well-being of Maria Belle and Dido, paying for the former's manumission papers and taking the baby to a responsible household to be cared for. The underlying white supremacist views of 18th century Britain and the family that is said to have raised Dido as an equal of her white cousin is immortalized in David Martin's Portrait of Dido Elizabeth Belle Lindsay and Lady Elizabeth Murray, a portrait in the grand manner style, an epic background, and a lifelike treatment of the sitters and their clothing. Kenelibes writes, "It has been claimed that this painting presents Dido and Elizabeth more or less as social equals, with both looking straight at the viewer, but this is not an unheard of convention in British portraiture featuring black servants. Paintings of white European women being attended to by black people, often in fantastical dress, were common fare in the 16th to 19th centuries. They almost always have the black sitter fading into the background, off to the side, or looking at the white sitter to symbolize their loyalty. I admit I used to have a soft spot for these kinds of paintings before I was educated about their dynamics. Having understood the erasure of blackness in slave societies and the projection of white European power dynamics in neoclassicism's use of color and space, I was a little happy, something like relieved, that some black people living in a time of horror and death for many others at least had their likeness and some small part of their life recorded in some or other great historical masterpiece. Another commonly seen gesture is for the white person to be seen touching the black person fondly in some way, and for the black person to be holding or offering flowers or fruit. These very gestures are being undertaken by Dido and Elizabeth. Many aspects of this painting actually are in the tradition of servant and master portraiture. Indeed, in the 19th century, viewers saw only a mistress and her servant, and labeled the portrait thusly. We know that Dido was a gentlewoman in her own right and accord her more agency in the creation of this painting, but perhaps that was their goal all along, to create a work depicting equal status while allowing viewers outside of the family to frame the relationship in a societally acceptable way. Furthermore, Dido's costume is an anomaly of artistic interpretation and maybe the whims of a fashionable young lady seeking acceptance or acknowledgement in society. By looking at portraits of ordinary women's dress, even in the aristocracy, we know that what she is wearing is not what she would have worn day to day, compared to Elizabeth, whose dress is easily recognizable as a normal 18th century dress by its shape and decorations. There is a 1779 source that records her wearing a cap in company, not a turban. This is an Orientalist fantasy costume, possibly made up by the artist, and to modern eyes serves to highlight her difference in skin color to Elizabeth. However, while this costume is not conventional dress, it is an artistic convention. Having one's portrait painted in this kind of white wrap dress in a scenic background was exactly the fashion in the 1770s in England, as well as in the decades before and after. So when I see these pictures of Tyla, as someone who will stop and analyze a piece promoted as visual art, I naturally get into considerations about the historical portrayal of Black people and now the rise and popularity of models with very deep brown tones. These pictures, which are part of an editorial series no doubt meant to capture her star power, her fashion, and other aspects about her that the public loves, have other people in them, so some analytical attention is deserved where they are concerned. But are these people admirers? Are they meant to represent muses, teachers, friends? Are they randos? Are they background? I always want to be authentic to myself, she declares in the headline of the article, an editorial piece written by Nicholas Tyrell Scott, styled by Eb Kamara, and photographed by Hugo Comte, obviously meant to introduce or reacquaint the world with, quote, the first true star of amapiano. I can surmise that the creative brief for the shoot called for Tyla's musical dexterity and novel stardom to be captured. But what does this piece have to do with that style of portraiture from centuries ago, right? The portraiture of the Renaissance was a record of people's appearance, and of course, those who could afford this also had the habit of putting pointers to their wealth, status, and clues to their personalities in those pictures. Photography has come to replace painting for this purpose. Just like the monarchs and nobles of centuries long ago wanted their majesty and riches imprinted on a board, so too do the global corporate conglomerates, international organizations, and rich, famous, or otherwise influential figures wish to have pretty much the same of themselves and their story committed to the pages of a magazine and or prominently featured on the homepage of said magazine's website for a definite period of time. The Portfolio Builder for Creatives format says editorial photography is rooted in journalism and fashion, so telling stories and artistic dress. There's a creative brief to be followed, entailing the general narrative and some level of specification about location, wardrobe, and style, which is open enough to allow the photographer and team some creative freedom in how the pictures will look eventually. We, as consumers of popular culture, are arguably more exposed to editorial shoots than fantastical scenes of ancient Rome featuring a 16th century it girl, making projects like Sharika Mosley's analysis of the appearance of Black Africans in selected paintings from the 14th to the 17th centuries a very helpful resource in observing the historical journey of artistic portrayals of Africans and what it was to be Black. Mosley observes that those images of Africans echoed the racist attitudes of the slave trading and colonizing patrons of the period, the Black figures comparatively inferior to white Europeans.
In particular, these images blur the line between person, object, and aesthetic to define the Black characters as other. The result was a marginalization of these figures, and conversely, the elevation of the white figures portrayed with them. Black Africans were reduced in these works to the status of ornamental accessory, much like the pearls, gold buttons, and polished armor that were used to convey and advance white hegemony.
The analysis uses Paul Kaplan's argument that Isabella d'Este, an Italian noblewoman and patron for the arts, and Andrea Mantegna, a painter, were responsible for the creation of the illustrative tradition of a black attendant to a white European protagonist to suggest the universal reach of imperial power. According to Kaplan, this was the taste among many European rulers. The presentation of Africans or black people in the media by those involved in journalism and celebrations of popular culture can be looked at as a continuation or result of the above-mentioned Renaissance portraiture. Let me yap a little more about this. So, visual art is still heavily impacted by old masters, Botticelli, Titian, Da Vinci, I don't know, people like that. Not so much thematically, but probably stylistically. These are all venerated European figures. The disruption, destruction, and suppression of non-European classical or antique art is one overwhelming majority of historically acclaimed artists are European. It follows that modern artists and curators of art would seek out and reproduce these same aesthetics, right? What you see in neoclassical works is a tendency to have kind of a focal point, and it's sketched out in color or framing with architecture or some feature in nature or the positioning of a person. I think it's also prevalent in contemporary photography. We don't like blurry pictures, put our cameras to settings that'll pick up certain colors to set a particular mood. Certain filters mean certain things like sepia or black and white. So the artist or the photographer lends their unique eye or their special talent, their special way of doing things to portray what has been commissioned from them, and their sitters and models aren't so much a person in these works or in these photographs as they are a figure portraying something else. As a contemporary reader, I see someone rich, dressed up in designer, probably promoting something, probably would benefit monetarily from people seeing or admiring the image, and the work is commissioned in service of some worldly goal. It's not for beauty or for pleasure, which is what I would hope is the reason behind why art is being made. But let me nip it there. Denzel Nyathi writes on British Vogue's issue celebrating the rise of black models.
Vogue magazine as an empire has acted as a relatively good marker gauging industry attitudes reflected on a large scale, at least within a Western context. This specific context tends to be faced with criticisms of exclusivity in representation, in everything from race to gender presentation. To this day, Africa still lacks representation, even through a single country in the franchise.
To be sure, not every single artistic rendering of Africans or black people created for public or mass consumption embodies racial biases like these striped garments and earrings, often used to subtly but effectively convey a lesser status for persons of color. These images, as cultural texts, can elicit notions about us held by non-black or non-African people to an extent. The creative direction for Tyla's Dazed shoot must have been something like your run-of-the-mill day in the life of a pop star thing with a twist, right? I think this is common and works well for the intended purpose, give the fans and public something to remember their star by, and of course, recite the story of going from unknown to world famous.
Tyla's debut album is in service to her ancestry and a gesture towards pop's future, even with its genre-hopping palette of sounds drawn from Europe, the US, and South Africa. These genres may sound similar because people may say it, but I encourage them to listen to the roots where my sound originated from.
The text explains patiently, but the series of pictures alongside are less cohesive in their narrative. The members of r/Black Ladies had a range of responses to the question, do you guys think Tyla's Dazed photo shoot was odd? That make up the bulk of the criticisms against the concept and end results. I know it's not, but it's giving AI. It definitely looks strange, but I don't understand the concept.
Thank you. That's what I said. It feels thoughtless.
She looks like a sim.
This isn't AI.
Yeah, the first image almost looked like it was taken from a PlayStation 2 game. Early in the discussion, it's apparent that Kant or someone else on the team failed to deliver at the very least an inspiring location and set for the background of the pictures. The backgrounds alternate from a blurry piebald field of browns and greys and a Dazed Media red carpet banner with a Tyla TV motive. They're generic and aren't helped by the appearance of very similar hues in the foreground, punctuated by small fields of bold color, all of which are in the South African flag, so there's that.
And it's not just that the imagery is strange and like random, meaningless in that AI way. The photos themselves look weird. The lighting and backgrounds look fake. You know what it is? It looks like they did a low-budget amateur photo shoot in someone's basement with an iPhone and then auto AI facetune the results.
The story in the text and the one in the pictures don't quite work together. Of course, there is artistic license for the pictorials, but I think the absence of musical or dance elements makes the sports items even more distracting. Yeah, I'm completely missing whatever the message is. One guy has a baseball glove, the other has on a helmet. She's holding a clipboard but looks nothing like a coach. They're in suits, she's in undergarments. Yep, lost. I think photo shoots like this are so... especially when they're for black singers. I know she doesn't consider herself black, but let's be honest. The formula is always the same. Little clothing and sensual poses. No concept or attempt to do something innovative. It's always all generic. But what strikes the reader almost immediately, much quicker than the ineffectual props, are the characters around Tyla. Posed, stiff, suited figures with partially or completely distorted features. One Redditor thought they might have been generated or replicated with AI, thinking they were near identical, and many others believe that Gabriel Nial, Jeffrey Obed, Marvin Kwasi Adaye, and Ronald Dade were used like props. When haven't dark-skinned people been used as a prop? I think they're being used as props, but also them all being dark-skinned or similar in shade also focuses the eye directly at her. Kind of like when people make art in black and white but then have the focus in a bright red that obviously stands out from surroundings. It's probably the look they were going for, but yes, they are also props in this particular photo shoot as well, almost like mannequins.
Yes, it's weird how all the guys are the exact same skin color. It's almost like they're using them as a backdrop.
Almost like mannequins is right, like they were intentionally going for a lifeless look. I get what they were trying to do, but I think they didn't think through how it was going to read. There's honestly nothing I like about the shoot overall.
Colorism promotion. Titian deployed stripes and earrings in portraits to elevate the white European subjects in his works. This is the case with his painting of Laura de Dianti, mistress to Isabella d'Este's brother, a duke, in which her left hand rests on the shoulder of a small, probably male black attendant in an elaborately colorfully striped garment and golden double-pierced earrings.
The position of Laura's hand on the child's shoulder suggests his inferiority, as is the case in other portraits that include the kinds of young black children who were so prized at European courts. Laura's elite social status could have been conveyed without including the child. He fills an ornamental, aggrandizing role in the portrait, and her fair skin tone is highlighted by contrast with his dark flesh. Their striped silk costume signifies the wealth at Laura's disposal, rather than the financial or social status of the child. Court jesters were often depicted wearing stripes and bright colors. Costuming produces a striking contrast between Laura and the small child.
The dynamic between artists and sitters, patrons, and creative team is not what we've just observed. Tyla, Gabriel, Jeffrey, Marvin, and Ronald are all at work for a publication, and clothing is not so strictly imbued with social codes and conventions these days. However, the fashion and entertainment industries of Europe and North America that dictated to those elsewhere in the world have perpetuated the exclusion and/or othering of black Africans to uphold archaic standards of beauty and aesthetics. The steady increase in using models with richly melanated skin for high-end fashion brands' advertising has revealed inadequacies in the way people are willing to conceptualize imagery that considers or uses more than their skin tone. Denzel Nyathi describes,
In theory, I think that the creative direction and thesis for the cover deserve some applause for serving as an example of representation and inclusion. Representation is a practice and it requires actual work. Much of the controversy surrounds the tones of the photograph, both the atmospheric tone and the actual skin tone of the featured models. More so, the criticism was specifically focused on the darkness of the models' skin tones. Photos of the models from their social media and their sources outside of the shoot show that they are several tones lighter than depicted on the cover, therefore denoting that the models had been edited to an almost black complexion.
The 4 models photographed with Tyla, I think, have also had their skin tone darkened in editing to look similar, if not uniform, and have their clothing blended with parts of their skin or the background. Nyathi sums up the problem with this style.
The styling of the models in black formal wear, coupled with the serious gaze into the camera, generated controversy around the representation of Africa, seemingly at large, through their somber expressions. To shoot the photo in such low lighting that essentially raises diversity in skin tones makes the project counterproductive. It perpetuates the image of Africa as a monolith, one skin tone, one people.
Besides the movie Belle, this day's shoot also reminded me of my visual arts class in high school. We had to submit many still lifes to show our technique, but were quickly getting bored with fruit and vases when someone in the class decided to start doing chrome taps and other fixtures, and buddy, let me tell you, metallic surfaces had us in a chokehold. Like this TikTok, but just faucets, knobs, and other hardware, and the masters among us moved on to sketching or painting running water. To me, the way that dark skin models are photographed speaks to this rudimentary observation of the way different shades of color interact on a specified object or against a certain plane. I'm uncertain of the aims Compt and the creative team had for the final images, and I wonder about Tyla's understanding of the brief, which would be a helpful insight for reading the pictures. But the pictures themselves capture nothing more than work and jobs as they are. Teamwork, bold leadership, and rising to the top, right? Also, they will form part of a massive archive of the star's career in pictures, but ultimately they aren't pictures of Tyla by Tyla. Neither her artistry or authenticity can be gauged through this piece, as her creative input was likely minimal. From r/black ladies to close out the analysis, I do think some celebrities with enough star power and or a team that advocates for their image can influence creative decisions when partnering with a brand or doing a shoot with a magazine, but I wouldn't say that's the norm. The nature of the entertainment industry in which Tyla is competing is to be expansive and profit-seeking, like other capitalistic ventures. Something must be produced over and over again to be sold. Whoever knows Tyla Laura Seattle alongside Tyla the pop star can speak to the authenticity of her character wherever it is presented. This video is in the interest of understanding Tyla as a global political and economic actor in popular culture. All of the inspiration for Tyla's music, fashion, dance, personal history, influences, the personality infused in her singing, the way she chooses to move and dress, and how she chooses to share these things about herself. These are currently or potentially products for consumption, not just by South Africans and our unique interactions with popular culture, but by international or global audiences and our demand for a finished product. Under the old Hollywood studio system, an individual could almost expect to have a new or adjusted persona ready to go by their first public appearance. But that got notoriously abusive, and its falling out of use is highly debatable, as studio or rather record label managed pop stars in the 21st century still experience the systemic and undue control of their careers and finances. Entertainers and artists are now freer and sometimes called on to be more outspoken about their personal narrative, their backstory, if you will, so we can experience that elusive authenticity, irrespective of the author's youth, lack of experience, or just preparedness to share any personal narrative at all. I don't want to suggest that people with livelihoods tied to celebrity have an obligation to provide meta-narratives for their pop cultural output. I am pointing out that developments in mass media and communications can now facilitate interactions between artist and entertainer and audience that are less impersonal and formulaic than managers to consumers conversations like releases, press conferences, and publicity in general. So Tyla and team are, for all intents and purposes, engaging with the audience in a way that is traditional for launching a pop star on the world stage. The trajectory of aspiring internet or hometown performer to Grammy-winning sensation is storied enough that I don't have to go into details, I hope, but I'll provide a brief profile that'll be helpful as the exploration continues. Tyla is a 22-year-old South African singer who has captured the public imagination with her unique interpretation of amapiano and pop and her ambiguous racial character. Ezekiel Lewis, president of Epic Records, says, "I call her the most precious African export. She's a vehicle. She's bringing palatable forms of music from the continent to global audiences. If you like amapiano, you'll hear something in her records that you like. If you like R&B, you'll hear something you like. It's a bit of everything." This establishes Tyla as the commodity. Jutta Welds and Christina Rowley wrote,
"Most forms of popular culture are produced and consumed in industrial form. And these industries, their inputs, practices of production and consumption, and outputs, film, clothing, toys, transcend state boundaries."
And furthermore,
popular culture industries and franchises are worthy of study in their own right, as microcosms of international political economy, e.g. the practices of global tourism, fashion, or music industries. The Disney Corporation, for instance, is itself an important global economic actor. It is involved in global intellectual property rights, trademark and copyright issues, and disputes. It competes with other brands internationally. It engages in economic diplomacy. It has a global workforce. It sources products globally. Its consumer base is global.
I'll get to Tyla's reception by and presentation to global audiences more just after discussing the local, but I want to note Lewis's choice of words, particularly palatable forms of music, in the context of African cultural expressions is reductive, offensive, and threatens erasure. It goes without saying that by the time the music video for Getting Late was released, Tyla had garnered a strong fan base in South African young adult audiences who were innovating for and consuming amapiano starting around 2019 when, in my opinion, the genre began to have its specific imprint, entrancing melodies, the persistent whisper of shakers, and the log drum to replace the slowed down remixes of popular house or soul songs that were my introduction to amapiano. This music, nurtured in home studios and tested on listeners at groove, which is the term South Africans use to refer to the clubbing or partying scene in general, was representative of a number of other Kwaito house and R&B experimentations that struggled to attract larger audiences. So Getting Late was the mainstreaming of this collection of innovations that was, according to South African audiences, on par with the top shelf caliber of pop star. Hi you guys, this sounds like Ariana Grande on amapiano. I see this being played on Trace soon. Acknowledging that Tyla, her music and its packaging is a production that is sort of removed from its home, the township, the pub, After Tears, Mugeti, even though it would be wholly embraced there. And the song proves that amapiano as a genre is the most versatile in South Africa right now. The quality, technical and narrative of the video, and of course the 10 out of 10 song inspired a strong patriotic fan base brought on by a few factors. Amapiano as a genre, dance style and subculture is the work of Black people. The many indigenous people of South Africa do identify as Black when not specifically referring to our cultural, linguistic or ethnic identities, which is something that's really interesting and needs more discursive attention. The use of the term black is historically complex, and I actually can't cover it in this video, but basically it's debatable that it has always been used in reference to Africans exclusively. Hyphenated J on YouTube and TikTok has created several videos about blackness in the UK and the global dynamics of colonialism.
Colorism is the visual tell of who gets to experience racism.
About Tyla's South African audiences, black and not black, a multiracial individual interacting with and producing noticeably African black culture is a pull because it brings about warm feelings of the Rainbow Nation. Remember the 1995 Rugby World Cup? I don't, but I remember 2010 and Waka Waka. Wells and Rowley speak about a two-level political game. Internationally, it signaled South Africa's post-apartheid reintegration into the international community. Domestically, it attempted to create a rainbow nation as a new multicultural national identity. If you look at the comments under Tyla's YouTube videos, her music videos, you'll see that this extends to African consumers and producers who see the potential of market-suppressed African artists. I'm never at Groove. I'm at home watching Belle for the 17th time. I came by Tyla's music through internet osmosis, so I don't want to speak freely on the local critical reception of her catalog too much, but the point is South African audiences do not typically go further than acknowledging non-blackness and gentrified cultural artifacts in criticism, and would prefer to encourage, embrace, and support. And that is probably why Tyla and team were unprepared for the much more interrogative market she is shooting through now. Some things that are of note to Tyla listeners in the African diaspora, particularly where blackness or being of African descent is a culture or ethnicity not represented in the majority, which haven't been interrogated as much by local listeners, are 1. Tyla's apparent marketing as a black artist in the United States and subsequent clarifications that she is South African and colored. 2. What is meant by colored in that case, and can this be reconciled with Black American listeners' disdain for what is in their case an outdated name and slur, and their discernment in engaging with popular culture? And 3. An accusation that lingers for many a global pop star that she's a plant. How'd she get famous so fast? Dealing with the easiest first, I've already talked about her rise at home, so we know she's a popular South African artist who broke through to the lucrative US listenership with the help of a record label, and then we were locked down. People got into TikTok where her sound and other content already had a followership, making song and artist a hit with younger audiences more or less organically, making music she vibed to for other people her age. By the time Water came out, her voice was instantly recognizable, the sound dubbed by many online as emblematic of the summer of 2023, whenever that was for you. Briefly, I find it more useful to observe mainstream artists signed with management as continuing productions with ever-changing and most likely contentious goals, not lone individuals driven by a single or personal agenda. The back and forth between Team Tyla and Black American audiences is mostly concerned with the significance of acknowledging Tyla's coloredness. This must importantly be qualified by South African so that the historical context is immediately apparent, but I believe the African American scrutiny and suspicion of the use of the word is warranted, as many observers have taken care to point out similarities in the experiences of spatially distant communities who experienced mass brutalization at the hands of invaders, colonizers, and settlers. The colored people of South Africa are the characteristically multiracial and multi-ethnic communities of the region. Their ancestry is African, from the Aboriginal groups who first made contact with European sea rovers much earlier than 1652, according to heritage activist Tariq Millet, who eventually started trading with them and settling their home in the mid-1600s, such as the tragically infrequently discussed Krotoa, who worked unpaid for Jan van Riebeeck as translator, ambassador, representative, domestic servant, and more, to the children of often defiantly intermarried heterosexual couples from the 20th century and onward. Asian, from the enslaved people who were brought from regions of Malaysia, India, and Indonesia to carry the burden of labor for the VOC, as Jan van Riebeeck requested that the Lord 17 bring farm workers, domestic servants, artisans, and all sorts of laborers from VOC territories and trading partners in Asia, India, and other parts of Africa. And C. European. Interestingly, many of the settler European families of the VOC and British Cape Colony had African and Asian stammoeders or matriarchs, women who were deliberately forgotten from the family histories, whose progeny was needed to build up the outnumbered Christian population. The imperial governments that controlled the Cape Colony were based in European slave societies that operated in terms of social hierarchies. Everywhere these types of people went, they instituted some mechanism or the other that classified race. So they leave Europe and self-identify, mostly as Christian, and call whoever they find wherever they arrive anything from heathens to cretins, but eventually settle on some variation of the natives. The Europeans needed these things to be explicit because they meant to attach rights to one label and outlaw status to the other. With violence, they come a long way in achieving this goal, but are also unable to maintain 100% racial segregation. Europeans knew unity amongst the communities they oppress could topple their property empires. These communities actually called themselves Afrikaans way before the whites in the 19th and 20th centuries, having developed a lingua franca for themselves as they interacted at work, and cultivated a strong cultural legacy for themselves rooted in acknowledgement of their home and survival in Africa. And from the very beginning of talks between colonial and imperial powers, colored people in South Africa have stood up for the political representation of non-Europeans.
In the 1940s something, they started calling my people colored. But before that we were bastard, and before that we were Khoi. It is convenient for the settler to do that so that he can live in peace. First, murder all the Khois out of Hamburg. The ones that got away from the genocide ran to Kimberley to hide there. The ones that stayed here was a boerklong, who was obeying and saying, ja baas, nee baas. Because means yes in Kukugowap. Means no in Kukugowap. Now if you say then the settler hits you with the butt of his gun. There was a hole on every farm for the Khoi who doesn't shut up.
I use the term mix cautiously when talking about colored identity. While miscegenation is an important part of how coloredness is formed, racial mixing is not the only way that coloredness is socially or legally constructed. It is more accurate to think of coloredness as a mixture of people from different backgrounds than to think that being of mixed heritage makes someone colored. The Population Registration Act of 1950 recognized this reality. Malay coloreds were those considered to be direct descendants of enslaved Malay with no apparent mixed heritage. Cape colored referred to people who were thought to be descendants of mixed heritage that included Cape colonists, enslaved Malay, and indigenous African people. Griquas were classified on the basis of heritage and geography, mainly found in what is now the Northern Cape of South Africa. People whose heritage were mixed between European colonists and the Nama people. Other colored demonstrated the inability of the regime to fit coloredness into neat biological categories. Using cultural markers such as language, particularly the use of Afrikaans, friendships, economic status, and even food preferences as a way of excluding as many black people as possible from the status accorded to colored people. However, it was to exclude as many people of mixed descent as possible from whiteness, the ultimate status.
From South African History Online. The African People's Organization, although it recruited its members from the relatively small group of educated and economically comfortably well-off coloureds, was to become the most influential political organization for coloureds for almost 40 years. The APO shaped black political thought and culture for decades after its demise. It had as its original aims civilizing objectives as were prevalent at the time, advocating Victorian probity and abstinence.
The currency of whiteness is compliance.
However, it additionally emphasized achieving unity amongst coloureds, promoting education, opposing class legislation, i.e. discriminatory colour legislation, and defending the social, political, and economic rights of coloureds.
There was a golden period for the coloured man between the late 1920s and the early 1950s. Professor Dickie van der Ross and his counterparts, when the Brits came in and made education a focal point, they were the ones that became the doctors and the professors and the lawyers, and a sort of equality happened, and then apartheid hit them again. And then there were boys again.
After the South African War, when the possibility of a white minority state was first discussed, the APO focused its attention on the franchise question and with it the issue of education as a means to qualifying for the vote. Social and economic issues became secondary. From the 1940s onwards, division amongst coloureds and indigenous groups began to intensify as the racial classification system became legally enforceable with apartheid legislation. The coloured community today, as always, cannot be identified simply by skin tone. Race and that classification are not real. However, people who, one, have a bi or multiracial look about them, or two, those who are bi or multiracial or bi-ethnic or multi-ethnic, but identify as another race or ethnicity, are often called coloured or prefer to tick that box on official South African documentation. The identity walks a tightrope above affirming racial hierarchies, self-determination, rejection, assimilation, and celebration. So I don't have any sources for Tyla saying that she's not definitely black. I think that idea just came from the knowledge that she would, go on interviews and say that in South Africa she was racially classified as colored, whereas people had assumed she would be black. And I think that just comes up in interviews. People know that South Africa is multicultural, multiracial, so interviewers will, I think, naturally ask, which group do you fall into? That's neither here nor there. What I find interesting regarding the reoccurring discussion in the quote-unquote culture wars around Tyla. On the one hand, we have the very well-known small-town American figure who goes and becomes a national star. It's easy to digest because there's hundreds and thousands of examples of it. And on the other hand, you have the story of the African, the most oppressed continent in the world. Like you can see in Tyla's comment sections, the story of an African going out into the world and being so successful is obviously a great one to tell in the grand narrative of global pop culture. Some people might be invested in either one of these meta-narratives turning out successful. I think it's just the nature of the game. All of that considered, I think if Tyla was trying to play it safe, she'd stick to being labeled as South African. It's very easy to do, just love up on the flag, focus on the multiculturalism, and say you love the Rainbow Nation, as opposed to getting involved in all those aggravated discussions about racial classification and why you're using outdated terms, etc., etc. So, and if she'd been planted, I assume the rollout in that department would have been smoother. Historically, assimilation has proved to be a way for non-European people living under white supremacy. A little more about Krotoa. She is mentioned in Jan van Riebeeck's surviving diary, along with her uncle, male relative, or clansman, Auchumato, who was a chieftain of the Horingaikona people. The VOC men lived in their communities on the shores and learned how to survive the environment from them. But then the VOC and Jan needed land, livestock, and labor, and so began establishing master-servant ties with the Horingaikona and other Africans they ventured to engage with, even chaining and caging those who would not acquiesce, so that being friendly with white men meant receipt of valuable or pretty trinkets and continuing some semblance of normal life. With the arrival of the enslaved from Asia, their animal skin clothes suffered further condemnation as base or barbaric. Africans could improve themselves by covering up in servant uniforms or plain dress in the European or Christian style, further entrenching the idea of a racial hierarchy defined by relationships to whiteness. Krotoa was the first Khoi woman to undergo a Christian marriage and maintained a reputation for a while as a representative for her people. The Horingaikona could speak Dutch and Portuguese fluently. She synthesized her native language with those others to conduct negotiations, teach, and learn, as she initially saw no harm in welcoming the Dutch. By the 1660s, she was already exhausted by what she eventually saw as an invasion and theft and alcoholism. She protested regularly at the castle, but when she dared to do so in her animal skins and not traditional European dress, castle officials imprisoned her for immorality. Her story here only exemplifies how Europeans actively created a hatred of self in all non-Europeans that they needed to prosper, pointing to the white walls of their castle and cottages as right.
And of course, when you approach her history not from a white supremacist point of view, but from the point of view that the Khoisan are people with a culture, then there were all these huge questions that arose around the story that Jan van Riebeeck tells in his journals. Some 3 months before Krotoa starts to appear in the journal, there's a story of a boat trip on the Salt River and wanting to exchange beads and tobacco with a group of Khoisan in exchange for something, and they didn't want to take it. 3 months later, she comes up as a servant in Van Riebeeck's house. Why would a mother and a family hand over a young girl, somewhere between 13 and 15, to be a servant in Van Riebeeck's house? What I was doing was looking at the silences in the journals and in the white supremacist story of our people. And I was saying these silences speak volumes. They don't ask, was Krotoa's family not concerned about her? What kind of people do that?
Tyla's family at a glance is clearly mixed race. That cannot be the deciding factor in the matter of the family's cultural identity, and it cannot be the deciding factor in the matter of Tyla's recent claiming of a definitely black identity. In her own words,
Yo, guys, I never denied my blackness, and I don't know where that came from. I'm mixed with black, Zulu, Irish, Mauritian, Indian, and colored. In South Africa, I would be classified as a colored woman. In other places, I would be classified as a black woman. Race is classified differently in different parts of the world. I don't expect to be identified as colored outside of South Africa by anyone not comfortable doing so, because I understand the weight of that word outside of South Africa. But to close this conversation, I'm both colored in South Africa and a black woman. As a woman of the culture, it's and, not or.
We might both be colored culturally, but we are not the same. The problem with you and people like you who have left similar comments in my comment section is that when you see black people and representation, you don't see yourself. You see a different group, a different demographic. Now, culturally, yes, I do see myself as colored, but when I see a black person represented in politics or in business or in sport, I see myself there. So I don't say like, oh, colored people aren't being represented. I see myself there as well. And this is a very kind of tribalist mindset that has been left with the colored community, and it needs to stop.
So her look and sound is a clever curation of contemporary pop culture trends, but her USP is the electrifying Bacardi dance, and I say her potential to keep synthesizing little-known cultures with global popular culture. According to the song's producer, Tyla created her Bacardi combo with a choreographer for a performance of Water in Rwanda, a clip of which went viral. The Bacardi dance originated in Pretoria, but it's difficult to say when exactly, as Bacardi music is not typically commercially distributed, marketed, or publicized. The accompanying dance, I'll tentatively say, as I've seen this claim before, though I can't remember where, is rooted in the Shibelani dance of indigenous Tsonga people, and I think Dinaka, a traditional dance of indigenous Bapedi. Anyone, feel free to debunk me here, as I'm using context clues based on what I know about Gauteng black culture and its indigenous influences, and as seen in broadcast, mass, and social media. Gauteng, Tyla's home province, was historically the Pretoria Witwatersrand Vereniging or Vaal Triangle region, part of the Transvaal province of the former Union and then Republic of South Africa. Today, the province's city regions are home to a number of urban groups in Johannesburg, Pretoria, Soshanguve, and others. The Zulu, Tswana, Sotho, Tsonga, Pedi, Ndebele, Venda, Xhosa, colored, and white people of this area came from all over the country's superficially created indigenous homelands and territories to forge a multi-ethnic, multilingual, multicultural urban culture as the migrant labor system forced more and more people into the region. These people continued the fight against white minority authoritarianism, exemplified by the suburb and culture of Kofifi, Sophia Town, a poor multiracial suburb of Johannesburg destroyed during apartheid, where black culture, traditional, political, and popular, thrived. Gauteng is South Africa's economic and entertainment capital, as the locus of commerce and many production studios, theaters, and other industrial cultural ventures. I'd say somewhere late in the 90s, the beginning of Bacardi could be seen as indigenous language music artists began experimenting with American dance music, pop, funk, jazz, electro, and others to create the distinctive sound and its dance. And that, I think, is where I'm going to stop. The idea that Tyla appropriates black culture from seemingly producing images of herself that reproduce colorism to singing and dancing in ways that will be received well by black and global audiences, like I've covered in the exploration, is inextricably linked with the misconception that as a colored woman, she's an outsider to blackness. There's a lot more to explore in the ways that management in the entertainment industry engages in tactics like planting figures, or generally how patronage in the arts has continued to serve the interests of powerful elites, greatly coloring the cultural zeitgeist. So I had to cut a lot out of this video, and I hope that you enjoyed what I've put together and it's been worth your watch. Like I said in the beginning, I tend to dissect art from a historical perspective, so I enjoyed looking at the interaction of a contemporary artist with a centuries old media landscape as well. If you did enjoy the video, do me a favor and leave a comment below, or you could even subscribe. I'm still trying to figure out how to structure these things in a really good way, so if you want to help me improve my research and the quality of the videos, consider making a financial contribution via PayPal or Ko-Fi. This year has not been easy for me, so I'm proud to have this work to show during this shitstorm. So seriously, I'm so grateful to each and every person who's chosen to give me money and keep me afloat during this time. And finally, I want to say a big thank you to the quote readers for this video, who I've listed in the description, for being a part of my little project. And that is all I have for you for this video. I will see you with something else soon.